ever wondered why some people seem to have a gift for music? Have you ever wished that you could play by ear, sing in tune, improvise and jam? You're in the right place. Time to turn those wishes into reality. Welcome to the Musicality Podcast with your host, Christopher Sutton.
Welcome back to part 2 of this episode all about tone and the various meanings that word can take. If you haven't heard part 1, please give that a listen first. You'll find a link in the show notes to this episode. In part 1, we talked about 3 meanings the word tone can have when it means a sound. Firstly, people use tone interchangeably with the word note. Secondly, tone can mean a sound which is a single pure frequency, such as a 1 kHz tone. Thirdly, tone can mean the sound produced by a pair of notes a fixed distance apart, either one after the other or both together, meaning the interval between 2 notes. It's another name for the interval of a whole step, also known as a major second. So now let's move on to the 3 meanings tone can have when referring to just an aspect of a sound rather than to the sound itself. First of all, tone means tuning, whether you're sharp or flat. Now, this is a sketchy one. It mostly comes from the related word intonation. A singer or an instrument player's intonation means how accurately they're hitting the right pitches with their notes. Having bad intonation means being out of tune. So you might hear musicians, particularly singers, saying, for example, "I really need to work on my tone," or "I like how they sing, but the tone they produce can be really flat." To be honest, the word tone isn't often used this way, but what I've found is that musicians hear a lot about intonation and then unconsciously merge that together with what they hear about tone. That can get very confusing, especially because, as we've covered already, the word tone can be very much about pitch and frequency. So it's normally best to separate those 2 words in your mind. Tone has the various meanings we're talking about in this and the previous episode, and intonation is about being out of tune, sharp or flat. How should we use the word tone to refer to an aspect of a sound then? Well, first of all, we have the meaning that will be familiar to anyone who owned a stereo system in the 80s or has bought an electric guitar. Stereo systems often used to have a set of tone controls, a knob labeled bass, one labeled treble, and sometimes a mid one too. Electric guitars typically have 1 or more knobs labeled tone. So you might hear, for example, "I love how bassy the tone is from this guitar amp," or "I always set my stereo tone to full bass and full treble," or "You'll want to experiment with your guitar's tone control when you add distortion." This meaning of tone is simply the balance between the low and high frequencies in a sound, also known as the bass and the treble. So those bass and treble knobs on the stereo adjust the stereo's tone by reducing the amount of bass frequencies or treble frequencies respectively. On an electric guitar, the tone knob simply adjusts how much high frequency is allowed through, so turning the knob adjusts from a bassier sound to a more trebly one. So this is a nice clear definition. The trouble is that it often blends into the next, much more general meaning. So the third is that tone can mean the overall sound. If I had to pick 2 of the meanings we've been discussing as the most common, it would be tone meaning a note, and this one, tone meaning the overall quality and nature of a sound. You hear this one, for example, as, "Man, Hendrix has a unique guitar tone," or "Donna Schwartz's course has really helped me get a fuller and more versatile tone on my sax." I think it's guitarists and wind players who talk most about tone in this sense, but you'll hear it among bassists, singers, and all instruments and genres really. In fact, at Musical U, we previously published a whole series called Bass Tone, which discussed not just the bass treble type of tone, but all of the aspects that go into the sound you produce on bass, from the instrument to the amp, to the settings, to the playing style, to the effects pedals you use. So this meaning of tone is really all-encompassing, and to a large extent, it should more accurately be called timbre, which is the traditional word for the quality of a sound produced by an instrument or in music. If a saxophone, a guitar, and a piano all play a middle C note, any listener can hear that the instruments are not the same, and what they're hearing is the characteristic timbre of each instrument, which we might informally call its tone. In practice, we tend to use timbre to mean an instrument's natural sound, and tone to mean the things you control to bring out the best possible sound from the instrument. But it's a fuzzy distinction, and you'll hear both words being used for both meanings. In an ideal world, I think I'd recommend avoiding this meaning of the word tone, sticking with tone to mean bass versus treble, and using that odd-sounding French word timbre, or even just sound, to refer to the overall quality of a musical sound. But this use of the word tone isn't going away anytime soon. So those are the 6 meanings of the word tone. To quickly recap, a tone can mean simply a note, it can mean a pure sound consisting of a single frequency, or it can mean the interval between 2 notes that are separated by a whole step, a major second, meaning 2 half steps. The tone of a sound can mean how accurately it's on pitch and in tune, though it probably shouldn't be used to mean that. It can mean the balance of low frequencies and high frequencies in the sound, how bassy or trebly it is. Or it can mean the overall character of the sound, which is perhaps more accurately called timbre. Next time you hear the word tone, or use it yourself, I hope you'll now feel much clearer about which meaning is being used. And although you probably won't make any friends by going around correcting people, you might like to avoid using the tone meaning just a note and the tone meaning sharp or flat meanings, and sticking to the other, better defined meanings. Tone as a pure frequency, tone as a particular interval, tone as the balance of bass and treble, or tone as the overall character of the sound an instrument produces. I know this is a word that confuses a lot of musicians, so I hope this episode has been helpful for you. And if you know of any meanings of the word tone that we haven't covered in these episodes, please let me know. Shoot me an email at hello@musicalitypodcast.com.
Thank you for listening to the Musicality Podcast. This episode has ended, but your musical journey continues. Head over to musicalitypodcast.com, where you will find the links and resources mentioned in this episode, as well as bonus content exclusive for podcast listeners. That's musicalitypodcast.com.